now talking Fear Street Part 3, 1666, once again directed by Lee Janiak. Now, this obviously is the third and final part of the Fear Street trilogy of movies by Netflix that were based on the books by the author R.L.Stine, of course probably most famous for the Goosebumps series. Netflix bought this trilogy of movies that were made a couple of years ago from another distributor and decided to put them out kind of like a week apart when the original plan was to put them a month apart by the original kind of film companies. And here we have it. And in case you haven't seen the first two movies, it's a kind of a connected universe where the first movie takes place in the 90s, the second one takes place in the 70s, and both those movies, the style of horror was reminiscent of films that sort of came out within that kind of period of time. This one takes place in 1666, so we have kind of Puritan era style setting, similar to movies like the kind of The Witch. Obviously, they were not horror films then, so this is more like those kind of style of movies. And it tells the origin of the Sarah Fier character and how she informs the rest of this kind of story. So now we've kind of watched the three movies, we can kind of talk more about the series as well as just the kind of the film. And this particular film is not purely set in 1666. It's actually only half set in that kind of time period, with the second half of the movie actually taking place in the 90s and really being a conclusion to the kind of the first film and a couple of sequences in the second film as well. Anyway, so let's discuss a little bit about the story here. So as I've mentioned, this is the kind of the origin of what actually happened to the character of Sarah Fier, a woman who was accused of witchcraft and executed as such. And this kind of shows you what actually happened. May well be slightly different from the kind of the events that have been told through generations, through various kind of stories. And that's a kind of like a witch trials movie. You've kind of got all the settings there, the fear, the paranoia, neighbour accusing neighbour, and that kind of that mob mentality of people kind of just going along with the kind of a narrative that suits them at the time. And obviously back in those days, it was very much, the bad things were blamed on the devil and stuff like that. And then we have, I say, the second half of the movie, which is, once again in the 90s, and now our characters, armed with this knowledge about what's actually happened, are now better prepared to fight the menace ultimately and try and get this movie series concluded. So let's talk about, first of all, what I think works in this film. This film is a little different from the other two, as I say. It really has more or less equal parts. One set in the 1600s, one set in modern or sort of 90s era. So it kind of feels like two movies in one. And I know the second film it was top and tailed with the kind of the 90s section, but that was really just a couple of scenes, whilst this is literally half the film. One of the things that struck me most about this movie, I would say, is the cinematography especially. It's especially noticeable in this film, even though it's the same director over three movies. This to me was the most visually striking in some ways, and a lot of that was down to the cinematography. So we have our 17th century kind of initial part of the story, the first half, and because obviously this is a time where we didn't have a lot of modern conveniences, it's a lot of natural light in the kind of the exterior scenes, and then we have a lot of things where it gets dark by candlelight, which kind of gives the movie a kind of soft focus and almost an ethereal kind of quality that kind of I think works well with that sort of 17th century Puritan era style aesthetic. Conversely, I actually think when we get to our 90s sections, it leans into that kind of that neon flushed kind of like aesthetic a lot more than maybe even the first movie did. And you get a lot of long sequence in the kind of like the local shopping mall, drenched in kind of like neon lights and things. I think that kind of works really well, and very, very distinct styles of kind of lighting and cinematography within the two halves of the movie, making it visually very, very kind of interesting. The other benefit of having a movie where you have two very distinct halves is that I feel this movie offers a little bit something for everyone. If you're not so keen on the kind of the more dramatic elements that was in the 17th century kind of era, and the kind of the more of the kind of the paranoia and the fear of the unknown, then it kind of goes into more of your typical kind of slasher territory again in that kind of second half. And obviously the opposite is true as well. I like in the second half we're introduced to Gillian Jacobs actually has a little bit more to do in this movie, and we get another adult character who I won't spoil for you, kind of helping our gang. And I think those characters do elevate this kind of material. I have to say, in that second half of the movie, there was a really kind of fun kind of fight sequence that I won't spoil for you, but I got to say that was worth price of admission on its own. I think the acting of this movie series has been, at the best, pretty good, at worst, at least serviceable. I think, at the very least here, I think the actors do a pretty good job, never kind of embarrassing themselves into kind of any type of bad acting. But, again, we'll kind of touch upon that and maybe things that I think didn't work. But nonetheless, I never think the acting is bad here. I think it's all, at the very worst, at least serviceable acting. This one is maybe the least kind of violent in a way. I would say it lacks the brutality of the second movie and the kind of that big kill that was in that kind of the first movie. So as such, it's a little bit gentler, this film, I would suggest. So what doesn't work with this movie, I just want to touch upon the acting again, as I've mentioned. I don't think the acting is bad in this movie by any stretch, but I have to say our main character here, I think only does a serviceable performance. And it's not kind of like, you don't kind of think of this character or the kind of the actress that plays her as a particularly memorable kind of leading character. If I think back to the second film where we had Sadie Sink play the kind of the main character in that one, a lot more charismatic. And even in the first movie, the Maya Hawke sequence at the beginning, I feel that had a little bit more of a memorable kind of tinge to it. The biggest issue for me in this movie is the decision to have our characters in the 17th century portion played by the same actors that are in the kind of the 70s and the 90s versions of the movie. So they kind of like play different characters. So our kind of actress who played Dina is now playing Sarah Fier. And because of that, I feel the movie suffers from, you don't quite buy into their characters, because we've seen these actors play other roles, and obviously prior to watching this movie you've not seen them in this series, but here we're having to accept them as completely kind of different characters when we're watching them even in the same movie play a completely unrelated character. And unfortunately I think that makes the movie suffer from the fact that you can't really buy into as much what's happening in that kind of like that sort of past era, the kind of the Puritan era style movie. Now that may be just my opinion on it. Some people may feel differently about it, but to me I don't really like it when you have these kind of flashback sequences. A little bit like Wizard of Oz, I suppose, where we have the same actors playing it's a different role. It doesn't really work for me. I would have preferred. I think it would have been better. It would have seemed more jarring, I think, and kind of more memorable had it been actors that were not kind of related to the same actors as we see in the previous two movies. And I've got to say as well, to kind of really hammer that home, we get characters or the actors trying to put on like an Irish style accent in the 1666 portion of the movie, and then in the second half they're just speaking their American accents. And again, it just seems like you're watching actors. You don't really buy into it, and it feels a little bit kind of unnatural at times, and kind of a little bit jarring. Now, if you focus on the 1666 portion just for a little bit, I found this to be extremely predictable. There's no surprises here, and there's a reveal about a character who, especially in the first movie, who is someone who is a descendant for someone in the first movie, think, why is the camera spending so much time with this particular character? There's obviously going to be something more down the line, and it's just so obvious. And then yes, the big reveal here really isn't a big reveal, and I think where the story goes, it's extremely predictable. I also think it kind of can't help but become a little bit more soap opera as well, where we have this the parallels between the Sarah Fier character, who is the kind of like the woman accused of witchcraft, and what she's going through in regards to her romantic interests. And then that kind of like runs parallel with the kind of the 90s storyline. I thought, well, that's a little convenient, to the point where it feels a little contrived, and then even a little, you know, like a little bit like a soap opera element as well. It seemed like just to have it in there, and it ultimately kind of, as I say, just didn't feel like, it felt a bit convenient, a little bit contrived. As I say, this movie is probably, I think it's the most varied, certainly, but it's certainly the least brutal out of the films, and is, when you watch this series as a whole, you've got to say, this didn't need to really be 3 films, to be honest. In fact, the actual 1666 portion of this movie could have been a 5-minute flashback to kind of to set it up. It didn't need to be an hour long, and obviously they wanted to make the 3 films, and that's obviously what they've done. But it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Hobbit films, the Peter Jackson Hobbit films, where that was kind of stretched out to make 3 movies when it just didn't need to be. And it feels the same here. I mean, you could have had the same story, I think, in actually 1 movie. I don't think it needed to have 3 movies to tell the story. I mean, you know, I've enjoyed them to a point, but the story is so light, to be honest, and there's so, you know, there is a mystery involved here, but it's pretty basic, and it didn't need 3 films to kind of tell it. So that as much as it's kind of fun to revisit the 90s, the 70s, and then this kind of period as well, the concept seems somewhat stretched out, to be honest with you. So that's kind of all I'll say before I get into a little bit of spoiler territory here. But before I get to that, let me give you a score. Then, if you haven't seen it, you can kind of, don't have to watch any further. For me, this is still an above-average film. It's still a very well-made film. I think the Puritan era stuff has a good production value. I love the aesthetic of this kind of like the neon 90s and stuff like that. And I liked having a little bit more, for example, the Gillian Jacobs character to do and things like that. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. I think the second one was still probably the best for me, and that was, I think, because our lead character was that much more interesting. But overall, certainly an above-average film, but fraught with ultimately a little bit of mundaneness and the kind of the gimmick of having these 3 interconnected films, not enough really to kind of escape that. So 6 out of 10 for this one. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about some spoilers here. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, I am going to spoil stuff for you. So we learned that it was Sheriff Good, or at least his descendant, that is the true villain of this series. And I had a couple of issues with that because, we're talking obviously over 300 years in the past that this kind of like this guy does this deal with the devil. And I'm thinking, okay, so his descendant is made the deal with the devil. But are we honestly meant to believe that every kind of like generation has agreed to go along with that? So every generation in this family has decided, yep, I'm going to sacrifice people for deals with the devil. And to do what? To become a sheriff? It seems like, wow, dream a little bigger, buddy. It just seems, considering that you've had, I don't know, 7 or 8 generations of this, you would have thought that they would have got a little bit of a kind of deal here. You're a sheriff of a kind of a suburb. Wow, that's your reward. And I know, yes, you live in the sunny side, the nicer neighbourhood and stuff, but I don't know. It didn't seem like to me there was enough built into that. We're just meant to believe that every generation has got along with this without really batting too much of an eyelid. And then what happens logistically with that? I mean, it's the kind of the firstborn son of every kind of like generation of this family, has this pact with the devil. What happens if he didn't have a son? What happens if he had a daughter? What happens if he couldn't have kids? What happens if he decided not to have kids? It just seems like it's just like, oh, that's like a thing that will happen, and that's just the way it is. But when you think too much about it, it just rings a little untrue to me. The other kind of problem I think with having the actors play the same, different characters in different time periods, is that you're associating the Sheriff Good with Solomon Good, who is the kind of the bad guy in the 1666 person, and they're not the same person. This is a descendant, 7 or so generations later, and it's kind of like, it makes it seem like they're all of the same person. That's just not how it it works. I mean, we're meant to believe these people are more or less the same person throughout time, and even in the second movie, the 70s movie, it doesn't seem like the good character who would become Sheriff Good is all, he seems like a bit more of a sympathetic character, but we just have to accept that he's this guy who's happy to sacrifice people. Didn't quite work for me. Then let's talk about the actual killers themselves, and I have a problem with the setup for this, because the movie contradicts itself in regard to how these killers work. So we learn in this movie that essentially the good character, as in the family name Good, essentially writes a name on the wall, and then this person becomes like a slasher, for lack of a better word. Some type of crazed killer who then goes around killing random people, right? So that is what is said in the movie. And we see that, we see the little flashbacks of these killers, killing various people, and then, or anyone who gets in their way. But it doesn't really sort of explain why it's only Shadysiders, people who live in this kind of area. It's never really addressed, or how in another way, these killers in the 90s sections of the movie only ever seem to be going after the Dina character, and they literally in this same film are walking past other characters to get to Dina. But when we're told that they are just they're killing, even if it is Shadysiders, yeah, these people are in a Shadysiders, yet they just ignore them. It's literally the opposite to what we're told these killers do. So to me, there is a few plot holes in this movie that it doesn't really make sense when you kind of think about it, and you think about it in any type of logic. And that's just, I don't want to start picking holes at every single plot hole here. But to me, it was just a little bit playing loose, fast and loose with its rules. A little bit silly at times. But overall, this still is I would say, an above average slasher movie series. I'm not the biggest slasher fan, as I've said in previous videos, but I can still appreciate it's a well-made, well-made movie, and has some good moments in there. So it's a 6 out of 10 for this movie. I think the second one was my favourite out of all of them, and I think that was primarily because that had a largely different cast, and I think a more of an interesting and likeable lead character. This one, 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing it next time. Bye for now.